let's do our last talk, shall we? Gaea Crozier is a non-game wildlife specialist with Minnesota DNR's non-game wildlife program. She's based in Grand Rapids and has been with the non-game program for 18 years. Prior to that, she worked for the South Florida Water Management District on birds and Everglades restoration efforts. She's received her bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and master's from the University of Minnesota Duluth under Jerry Nimi. Gaea.
Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Gaea Crozier, and I'm going to tell you about some of the work that the Non-Game Wildlife Program has been doing on northern goshawks. So the northern goshawk breeds primarily in northeastern and north central Minnesota. We have documented 187 territories in Minnesota since 1990, and the counties that they're located in are highlighted on the map. We currently have about 60 known active territories in the state. The goshawk prefers mature and older forests, both for nesting and foraging. There's a telemetry study that was done by Dr. David Anderson at the University of Minnesota, and in this study he found that goshawks had a strong preference for older red pine and white pine forest, as well as aspen and birch forest. But they did use a variety of different mature and older forest types. Goshawks avoided young forest as well as lowland conifers. In this study, they found that habitat used for nesting and foraging is similar, but nesting habitat tends to be older stands. Stands that have large, taller trees that can support a large stick nest. Goshawk nests tend to be about 2 to 3 feet wide, so you need a fairly large tree to support a nest like that. And these stands also have fairly closed canopy. They also found that average home range size is about 25 square miles for a pair of goshawks. An additional study, a diet study that was done by Dr. Anderson's lab, looking at prey deliveries to the nest, found that diet is composed of a variety of small to medium-sized birds and mammals. The main species are listed here, but there really was a very large number of different species that were used. So the conservation status of the goshawk. Within eastern North America, goshawks have been declining at long-term monitoring migration sites. There have been significant declines at 9 of 14 sites over the past 20 years. At Hawk Ridge and Duluth, peak counts have declined by about 80%. You can see, I don't have a cursor. You can see that migrating goshawks have a cyclical pattern, and that it's this peak count that has been dampening over time. Within the upper Midwest, the goshawk is designated as a species of special conservation need across organizations. And within Minnesota, we listed it as a special concern species in 2013, primarily due to low abundance and concerns about habitat loss from timber harvest. The goshawk is a challenging species to manage for. It needs habitat over a large spatial scale because it has these large home ranges. The amount and spatial arrangement of habitat is very important. They don't use a small area of mature forest surrounded by clear cut. They need larger areas, about 200 acres, that can support nesting habitat as well as post-fledging habitat. So overlay on that, mixed land ownership, and it can get fairly complicated to manage for this species. The Non-Game Wildlife Program has put a lot of effort into this species because of its conservation status, because its habitat needs are hard to meet, and in doing so, we're providing habitat for a variety of other wildlife that need older forest and larger patches of forest. So next I'm going to share some of kind of an overview of the different projects we've been working on this species, but I want to make sure to emphasize that the work on this species is really a collaborative effort. Most of these projects I'm going to share today are a collaboration between the DNR, both of the national forests, the university, and tribal governments. So first is our interagency territory monitoring effort. This has been going on since 2003. The agencies in total monitor about 70 to 80 territories annually to keep track of where active goshawk nests are located in the state. We conduct broadcast surveys to try to elicit a response from a territorial goshawk. We search for active nests and check existing nests for signs of activity. So we're collecting data on territory occupancy, nest success, and number of chicks produced. So looking at our results, our average territory occupancy rate has been 71%. Our average nest success rate has been 70%. You can compare this to other averages that have been reported elsewhere in North America. Most averages are in the 80s to 90s range, and so we are kind of on the lower end of that. For productivity, our average is 1.5 young per successful nest, which again is on the lower end of what is reported in North America. These breeding rates do vary a lot from year to year, as we would expect. They're likely highly correlated with weather patterns and prey availability. So we have found that 71% of goshawk nests are located in aspen trees. Aspen form this really nice structure where you can support a large stick nest. But they do use a variety of different trees, such as those listed here. The forest type that a nest is located in, I can't even read from here, 39% are in aspen forest, and I should have brought my glasses, 28% are in red pine. So same as what was found with the telemetry data, aspen and red pine forests are important for this species, but they do use a variety of different forest types as well for nesting. Looking at the age of the nest stand, over 80% of our nests are found in forest that is greater than 60 years old, with the average ages for aspen and red pine listed there. This is not an old growth species, but it does require mature and older forest. Looking at the habitat composition within goshawk territories, the average within the nest area, which is typically delineated as a 48-acre area around a nest, is 59%, with again, aspen, pine, spruce fir being the common types that you're finding. 13% of this area is young forest. The post-fledging area, which we typically define as a 500-acre buffer around the nest, is composed of about 41% goshawk habitat, same main cover types, and about 20% young forest. So we can use this information to help us set targets when we're managing in goshawk territories to make sure that we're retaining adequate habitat. We recently wrapped up a project with the University of Minnesota doing some exploratory modeling to see what habitat types were correlated with goshawk breeding. And through this work, we found that within the nest area, goshawk nesting attempts and nest success were positively correlated with the amount of mature aspen and birch forest in the nest area, and they are negatively correlated with the amount of young aspen birch forest, as well as the total amount of habitat that had been harvested. This is what we'd expect given the ecology of this species. Nest attempts were also negatively correlated with the amount of lowland conifer forest. This is consistent with what was found with telemetry work where they're avoiding lowland conifers, but lowland conifer didn't impact nest success. This is a graph of some of those exploratory modeling results, looking at the impact that timber harvest has on the probability that a goshawk will have a nest attempt. You can see that the more harvest that occurs, the less likely it is that the goshawks will have a nest attempt. This is the first time we've tried to quantify this type of information to look more specifically at how our management may impact goshawks, so I'm excited to have this new information to help guide our management. Looking at goshawk territories that we've been monitoring that have had harvests, we have found that 80% of the territories were abandoned after there was a harvest in the nest area. But this is really more observational based on our monitoring data, so we're starting a new project. We started this year, where we're conducting pre- and post-harvest monitoring in 18 territories that are expected to have a harvest and 18 territories that are controls, so we can better pinpoint the effects of timber harvest on goshawk breeding. I wanted to point out that a common issue from timber harvest, besides, of course, the loss of habitat, is that it creates openings in the forest, and these openings allow open habitat species like the great horned owl to come in and invade the territory. They frequently take over the goshawk nest, and then the goshawks abandon the territory. So that's a typical pattern we see after a timber harvest occurs in a goshawk territory. Another project that we have been working on is using DNA to identify individuals. It's expensive and challenging to ban goshawks, so it's not likely that's something we are going to have the funding to do. So we were collecting molted feathers under active nests to see if there's sufficient quality DNA in those feathers to be able to identify individuals. And it turns out it is. We've identified 107 individuals through this effort. It's heavily biased towards the female, since the female spends more time on the nest. We've confirmed that goshawks show very strong site fidelity. We have the same females coming back and using the same territory year after year. But there can be changes in the female over time. So you can have a new female come in and take over a territory. I'm interested in this mostly because I think this is a potential tool for examining how birds respond to a timber harvest. When a harvest happens and birds are displaced, are we able to locate them elsewhere? Are they able to successfully breed in another location? In 2008, Dr. Anderson's lab, along with partners in Minnesota, tried to attempt to do a population monitoring project. Baseline data were collected in 2008, and through this effort, we found that goshawks are widely but sparsely distributed in Minnesota. Goshawks occupied about a quarter of the sites that had suitable habitat. A very, very rough population estimate from this work was that there are about 300 to 1,300 breeding pairs in Minnesota. If we compare this to the number of known territories in the state, it's likely that the population estimate's closer to the 300 end of that range. Unfortunately, we found out that due to the low abundance and detectability of goshawks, it's not possible to detect population trends with a reasonable amount of funding. This is a common problem with rare species, that it's very difficult to monitor them with the resources we have available. So we can't directly monitor the goshawk population, but this is a special concern species. One of the main threats is timber harvest. We need to understand how this species is doing. Since habitat is a primary concern for this species, can we look at habitat trends to try to use this as a proxy for the goshawk population? So looking at change in goshawk habitat on DNR lands, this is for older aspen and red pine, so this represents that preferred nesting habitat that they use. In green, you can see red pine has increased slightly from 2004 to 2022, but really the most abundant habitat that's available for goshawks is older aspen. Older aspen has declined by 61% on state lands from 2004 to 2022. If we look towards 2028 as a prediction, the DNR has a list of stands that we plan to harvest. If we harvest everything on that list, 89% of our older aspen will be lost between 2004 to 2028. However, it's really important to note that not every stand on our list gets harvested. So we are going to lose habitat from 2022 to 2028, but it's not going to be as low as this. Not everything will be cut that we've identified. Looking towards the future, the DNR's policy is to maintain 2.5% of aspen as over the age of 60. So that's the level that we would like to keep aspen at moving into the future. Clearly, this is disheartening information for goshawk lovers and other species that need older forest, but it is important to put this in context of what's going on with other landowners. So if we look at habitat on all lands, so this would cover federal, state, county, private lands, aspen has declined, but it's not as drastic. It's been 6% over the time period of 2003 to 2015. What this decline, though, really represents is a large decrease in the amount of habitat on state and county lands, which is being mostly offset by a large increase in the amount of older aspen on private lands. So this begs the question, then, is the habitat that we're losing on public lands equivalent to the habitat that we're gaining on private lands? And the answer to that question is that we really just don't know. We don't have good habitat data, specific habitat data of what's on private lands. This information is estimated values of habitat on all lands. They're extrapolated data, so there's some error associated with these. We don't know specifically what forest types, what age classes, and probably very important for this species, patch sizes are available. Do we have the several hundred acres that are needed on private lands to support goshawk territories? So this is discomforting to see this loss of habitat on public lands and our reliance on private lands, of which we really don't know specifically what's there. Looking at goshawk territories that we've been monitoring to see how much habitat loss has been occurring. The average habitat loss was 26% during a 10-year period, looking at all ownerships. This is surprising compared to the previous graph I showed you. We would think it would be closer to that 6% range. This implies that the habitat in goshawk territories may be more at risk than what kind of general landscape scale habitat trends indicate. Makes sense. Goshawks use larger complexes of older forest, and this is going to be more vulnerable to timber harvest. It's much more profitable to go in and harvest a large area of forest than a smaller area. So these goshawk territories may be more of a target. So looking at future efforts, we need to continue to advocate for protecting known goshawk territories. Goshawks show extremely strong site fidelity. When we have a location where they're breeding successfully, we need to make sure that we continue to maintain that area properly, particularly in the light of the fact that we have uncertainty about what's going on in the greater landscape with habitat change. We need to continue to monitor these habitat trends so we can keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on. Is habitat continuing to decline at a slow rate, or are there changes with that? We need to obtain better information on how private lands are contributing to goshawk habitat. If we're depending on these private lands to provide goshawk habitat, we really need good data quantifying what's there and how habitat is changing over time. And last, we'd like to explore the use of using habitat suitability models to examine habitat trends. We've done some of this modeling in the past. What I've shown you today are fairly crude numbers of total changes in total acres, but we can do better than that. We have data on how much habitat's needed for nesting, how much habitat is needed in the post-fledging area. We can take a more nuanced approach to model this habitat, identify places that do have enough habitat to maintain viable territories, and track how that changes over time. So those are some of the things that we will be pursuing in the future, hopefully. So thanks very much for having me today. I just want to give a shout out thank you for your continued support for the Non-Game Wildlife Program. It's your support that makes projects like this possible. Thank you.
And questions for our last speaker? We've got a couple.
Maybe I didn't catch it, but did you say when the typical nesting period is for northern goshawks?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
When should we look for activity, during the year?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I didn't include that. So goshawks typically start becoming fairly territorial, defending their nest area in early March. Eggs are usually laid in a very early spring. It would be late March, but more typical is about mid-April. And then there's usually chicks in the nest by late May, early June, and they typically fledge around mid-July.
Dan Call, in your opinion, do you think fishers are a significant predator of goshawks?
Yes, they probably are. We've tried to, as much as possible, determine why a nest failed, which can be quite difficult, but there's been evidence of fisher predation, claw marks on trees, It's thought that fishers are one of the main predators. Great horned owls are also a major reason of nest failure, more often for nestlings, but can be for adults as well.
Hey, I'm Lynn Schofield. I'm with the Institute for Bird Populations. And so I do goshawk stuff in California, a lot related to wildfire. And our findings are our birds are almost intolerant of the wildfires. And I know Minnesota has had some pretty notable ones up by the boundary waters. Do you have a sense if those are causing, how those are affecting goshawk here, which use the habitat, slightly different habitat structure and species and stuff?
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. We do not do any monitoring in the boundary waters except for the very peripheral part of it. Most of our monitoring is done on managed lands where wildfire or even prescribed fire is pretty uncommon. Timber harvest is definitely the most common disturbance that happens. So I'm afraid I can't speak to that. I'm sorry.
Cool, thanks.
We're down to one microphone, but I can take at least one more question. I'll have to scamper to the other side of the room if there's any over there, but all right, we've got one here.
Thank you, Gaea. Kurt Resterholz, DNR Forest Policy Consultant, retired. It's really distressing to hear the continued decline of goshawks and the abdication of biodiversity conservation by top levels of the DNR. We had a policy in place to maintain older forest on commercial forest land, particularly aspen. And when we were talking about that in 1988, we realized that aspen wasn't old growth, but we didn't want all young aspen on our forests. And that seems to be the way we're going. But thank you for your research.
Yeah, hi, Kurt. Thanks for that comment. Yes, we used to have a policy in place that we'd retain about 10 to 15% of aspen as well as other cover types as older forest for primarily wildlife and other biodiversity. That policy was rescinded. It was decided that there was enough habitat on other lands that we didn't need to have specific targets on our own lands for older forest. So our current policy is we just retain 2.5% of aspen as older. That's where we're at.
Just a question about aspen. Is aspen generic to, when we talk about aspen, it seems like today we're always talking about trembling aspen or quaking aspen. Is it also potentially a nesting tree in big-tooth aspen or other aspen species?
Yeah, that aspen is a generic term for all the different aspen species out there. It really forms that really nice, beautiful crotch that they can put a stick nest into. So even when they're nesting in like a pine forest, they often select that really large, big aspen tree to put a nest in.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.